Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition here of Point of View. Looking forward to 3 hours with you, if you can stay with us. We're going to, the first hour, talk about some of the issues in the news. Of course, one thing we'll be watching is, of course, the vote taking place today in Georgia for 2 U.S. Senate seats. And I could go through all of the reasons why that's important, but my commentary today talks about that a little bit, and I think you probably heard it by now. If you don't know, we will maybe entertain that a little bit later, but that will be one issue we'll be looking at. Do want to talk about vaccine policy for just a minute, because it has really surfaced as an issue. Then I thought I would maybe talk about a memo that came out in Dallas. Now, I recognize not all the listeners here live in Dallas. A lot of you probably don't care, and I certainly don't try to cover those kinds of local stories very often, but it has a more significant impact than just Dallas, and that has to do with this recommendation that was suggested that we might encourage the police not to investigate and actually even follow up on 911 calls for various things, and we'll get into what that might mean in just a few minutes, because it is pretty significant indeed. They will no longer take calls for burglary of a motor vehicle, attempted car theft, criminal mischief, reckless damage, graffiti, child custody interference, and of course the mayor very quickly cut that off. But I want to talk about that because it is another trend that we're seeing today, having developed in Dallas, but nationwide, and so I think it's worth covering. So we'll get into that as well. Also, just the other day, I mentioned how close the vote was for Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. We now know that they actually constructed, in the dark of night, as somebody pointed out, a plexiglass structure so they could bring in people that were tested positive for COVID-19 and others that had been around people that were COVID contacted, so that you can get enough votes. Now, flip that around and imagine if we were talking about a vote in the past for John Boehner, for Paul Ryan, or in the future, Kevin McCarthy. Can you imagine the way the press would have covered that? And you're probably hearing about that right here for the very first time. So anyway, those are just a few things we'll get into, as well as some other commentaries that we will try to cover in the next hour. But at 1 o'clock, David French will be with us. We'll be talking about his book that came out a while back, Divided We Fall, America's Succession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. I am a little skeptical of how well we can restore this nation apart from maybe a whole-scale religious revival. But also we've posted one of his articles on why do they hate us, and that, I think, illustrates, again, kind of almost, if you will, sort of the coming persecution of Christians. Maybe not persecution with a capital P, certainly persecution with a small p. And then Victor Avila will be with us in the next hour at 2 o'clock. He has written this book, Agent Under Fire. When he and another ICE agent were attacked, his partner was killed. He barely survived, and so has been certainly an expert on narcotics trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking, smuggling, the whole issue of immigration and the border. So that would be enough, and we'll probably spend some time just talking about his book. But then he also read for the city council. He's also been involved in a committee that has tried to take kind of almost Marxist ideas and implement them in the classroom. So we're going to have a lot of things to talk about with him, and he'll be in studio. So that's 3 hours, and All of that taking place while, of course, a very important vote for the U.S. Senate today in Georgia. But I don't say much more about vaccines because whatever you say, I get emails. You know, if you're talking about the value of the vaccine, then the anti-vaxxers write in. If you talk about some of the dangers, as we did yesterday, then you have people saying, bringing up these issues, you're threatening the future of our country and your people are going to die and all that. So I try not to talk about too much, but if indeed you think a vaccine is a possible solution, Joel Zinberg raises a very good question, and I want to raise it right now. Why are we vaccinating people who have recovered from COVID-19? Last night I was watching Channel 8, and they were talking about an individual that had actually had COVID-19, and then the procedure you go through by which you can get a vaccine. If you are coming out of the symptoms, they're suggesting that you wait 90 days before you get the vaccine. And, of course, after you get the first one, you're supposed to get the second one, both with Pfizer and Moderna. Okay. But given the fact that those individuals probably have antibodies that will protect them at least in 2021 or during most of 2021, and given the limited supply of doses that we have, Joel Zinberg asks a very good question. Why are we putting these vaccines into individuals that, first of all, are not in danger, political candidates and people that have been able to get their way into the front of the line? And then, second of all, given the fact that at the moment we have a short supply, why don't we put those in the hands of individuals that are going to be giving them to people that are most at risk, perhaps, of dying of COVID-19 if they catch the virus? It makes too much sense, but of course we don't have that kind of sense. And again, he points out the fact that now that Pfizer and Moderna have received emergency use authorizations, the tough work of deciding how to allocate those, of course, begins. But given the fact that both of these are in short supply, and it is going to be exacerbated by some of the recommendations that have come from the CDC, and I've talked about this before, when you have limited supplies, why don't you think about vaccine rationing? And it gets us into a word that I've used before on this program, triage. Now, triage is used in the medical field, primarily in the battlefield, but again, triage comes from the French word trier, which is the idea of to sort. And you have some incoming wounded that have such significant wounds that you probably cannot save those individuals, and so oftentimes they set them aside simply to let them die. You have others that come in a second category that have superficial wounds, but you could probably set them aside and get to them next. And you focus your time and attention on those who have such significant wounds that if you don't deal with those right that moment, they will die. And so you put a set of priorities together. And it seems to me right here would be a great idea of trying to apply this idea of triage when you have limited supplies. Now, as I pointed out, it's quite possible that indeed we will not have that problem very soon because we're starting to find that some of those people that were given a priority, those would be frontline workers, as I shared with you yesterday, anywhere from 60% all the way down to 30%, but the average seems to be about 50% of them say, we're not going to take the vaccine. Well, that may free that up, but at least at the moment, there is some suggestion that individuals who actually have had significant symptoms, or even if they're asymptomatic, this second page talks about that, seems like they probably will have developed an immune response, which may not last forever, but seems to suggest that these antibodies can be detectable for at least a year, all the way up to 3 years. So could you not put them aside as like that second group that have superficial wounds that don't need to be treated at the moment, and focus your time and attention on those individuals that are like those people where if you didn't treat their wounds right away, they would die? Let's actually give the vaccine to people who might actually die from COVID-19. I know that's common sense, but I thought I'd pass it on to you. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today, there are two U.S. Senate elections in Georgia. Of course, you know that because they will likely determine the direction of the U.S. Senate and the country. In past years, a runoff election for the U.S. Senate did not garner much attention from most Americans, but this has not been a normal year. And this year of 2021 is starting off with even more turmoil. In addition to these two U.S. Senate elections in Georgia today is the certification of the Electoral College votes tomorrow. In past years, this has been routine and rarely controversial, but this has not been a normal year for elections. When you think back to last year, you see lots of examples of turmoil that reminded us of previous years. For example, the year began with an impeachment that reminded us of 1974 or even 1998. Then we had a pandemic that reminded us of 1918. That was followed by a recession that exceeded what took place in 2008. Then we had street riots like those in 1968. And finally, we had a contested election like the year 2000. We have managed to pack as much turmoil into one year as anyone could possibly imagine, and the beginning of 2021 looks like more turmoil could be on the way. When the Census Bureau started to track Americans' income, they concluded that nearly half had lost income since March. As I mentioned yesterday, much of the impact has fallen on the minorities and the poor. Will America get back to normal very soon? We certainly hope so, but the economic impact will follow these families into the year for many months. This is a time to remind each other that God is sovereign and in control, even when things look out of control. Christians in previous centuries have lived through much worse than what we are facing, and they learned to trust in God and be faithful witnesses. We must do the same. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention again at the top of the hour, we're going to have David French with us. But let me get on to one other issue. But just before we do so, let's talk one more at maybe a few minutes on the virus itself, because people are starting to say now, get ready to hear some words like the United Kingdom strain or the South African variant, I guess is how you would pronounce that. And first of all, can I at least make the obvious statement that now that we are starting to talk about different mutations of the coronavirus, we're quite willing to acknowledge where the variations have been found. One, for example, in London or the UK strain, and the other one now the South African variant. And this is no problem for the same individuals that were absolutely furious with various individuals, including the president, referring to this as the China virus or the Wuhan flu. So again, hypocrisy reigns, but let's get back to the issue. Most mutations of viruses don't change that much, but some do. It does appear, and I'm not claiming to be a biochemist, although I've had biochemistry background in classes, and I don't claim to be a doctor, although I grew up in a family where medicine was very important. But nevertheless, given what I've been able to determine, it turns out that the United Kingdom strain, sometimes called the London one or the UK strain, it's called B117 if you want to be politically correct and not locate a geography, seems to be easily transmitted, a lot easier to actually pick that one up. but it doesn't seem to be that much more virulent. That being said, there are some people now that are wondering if this one from South Africa, and it's called the South African variant, until some of the politically correct people out there tell me I can't call it that anymore, and that is that there are scientists in South Africa that have first found this mutation, say there is some concern that it may be more resistant to the current vaccines currently being administered around the world. Now, again, that may be an attempt to get everybody's attention, and it may not turn out to be the case, but you can see very quickly if indeed we are actually injecting a vaccine into individuals that will protect them from the particular coronavirus that we have in this country, but may not be effective in the one that has now been identified in South Africa. So that's the case that people are looking at right now. And the fact is that they say the virus here has mutated far more than the variant in the UK. And one of those mutations might mean that it could evade attack by antibodies that would normally be used to fight the coronavirus. Now, the professor that was identifying all this said that it was unlikely that the mutation in South Africa would make the current vaccines useless, but he also was fearful that it could maybe weaken the impact of those vaccines. Another vaccine expert said, fortunately, should further modifications of the vaccine be required to address these new variants, some of the vaccine technologies under development could allow this to be done relatively rapidly. So again, for people that are saying, I might be getting a vaccine for a variant that I can't actually fight off with my antibodies, the good news is we still have incredible medical technology here in the 21st century that is the case. So 23 million individuals around the world, according to Worldometers, have COVID-19. Now, again, we've on this program many times pointed out that sometimes because you have the particular virus doesn't mean that you're going to die of the virus, doesn't even mean that you're going to have very good symptoms, but it does mean that this, from a world point of view, is significant. And so a variant in the midst of that 23 million estimate is something to pay attention to. And if nothing else, I thought that if you hear the words South African variant, maybe that, if nothing else, would cause you to think about this in a little more detail. And if nothing else, it just illustrates to me the broader point that I'm sure some of you are smiling about or really rolling your eyes about, and that is we were not allowed to call it the Wuhan flu. We were not allowed to call it the China flu, and there were many confrontations in the press offices and in various press conferences whenever somebody like the president would call it the China flu or the Wuhan flu. Now we're hearing almost every day about scientists talking about the United Kingdom strain and the South African variant. But again, I don't think that would surprise anyone. So let me move from vaccines and viruses to Dallas. And again, I do this recognizing that, after all, not all of you live in Dallas, but what is happening in Dallas is maybe a preview of what might happen in other states and in other cities. And that is that there was a newsletter that was put out by the mayor of Dallas, Eric Johnson. By the way, a Democrat who served in the legislature. One of those Democrats, by the way, that you can talk to. There are certain ones, Colin Allred, Eric Johnson, and you have a conversation with them. There are others you can't. And actually, he's done a pretty good job as mayor, but he put out his newsletter that said this. Hope you had a great New Year's Eve and a New Year's Day. Unfortunately, the city got off to a bit of an inauspicious start to 2021 in regards to public safety strategies. Yesterday, reporters obtained an internal Dallas Police Department memo saying that beginning Monday, that would be yesterday, police officers would no longer be dispatched to certain crimes, such as burglary of a motor vehicle, attempted car theft, criminal mischief, reckless damage, graffiti, and child custody interference. He says, I knew nothing about this memo or plans to implement such a strategy, Neither did city council members, nor did the incoming police chief, Eddie Garcia, who starts next month. Okay, so far so good. First of all, not so good. What in the world is at least one individual somewhere in the Dallas complex doing? First of all, writing such a memo, but second of all, then actually somehow letting that memo get out so that the mayor does not know about it, the chief of police does not know about it, the incoming one, the interim chief of police, by the way, did not know about it, and the city council did not know about it. Somebody needs to at least come forward and say, okay, my mistake. We'll see. But then I thought this was interesting because, up until now, it's like, Mayor Eric Johnson, you had me at New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. Okay, I appreciate the fact that, this happened and you had no ability to know what it was. Until you read a little further, because then after the memo became public, the interim police chief, that would be Lonzo Anderson, said that the email was part of conversations that had been regarding recommendations from a group called KPMG. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And the memorandum was sent prematurely. Okay, you lost me on prematurely. If you'd said, okay, it's rescinded and it's not something we're actively thinking about, but you had me on New Year's Day, you lost me on prematurely. You mean you're seriously thinking about this? And I suspect that is the case. I'm coming up to a break, so I'll just start this, but continue afterwards. It turns out that the firm KPMG was actually hired by the city to evaluate the police department. And what they concluded is when they looked at the 911 calls, they found that many of those calls were for like a major disturbance, a suspicious person, a minor accident, business alarm. And so as a result, only 2.25% of them resulted in an arrest. And so I think the argument being made is you're spending entirely too much time responding to various 911 calls. And so let's now tell the dispatchers that if it's just for simple things like the burglary of a motor vehicle or an attempted car theft, criminal mischief, reckless damage, graffiti, or even child custody interference, we won't necessarily see those as priority calls. Do you love that? Of course, this is coming from the same police department, at least the district attorney saying, we're not even going to necessarily prosecute petty theft, which is defined by any person stealing less than $750. And so you start seeing a trend here. And the trend is, given the fact that we are underfunding the police and given the defund police mindset, maybe we'll just not criminalize certain crimes. We'll just decriminalize them. We won't consider them priorities. And I think this is a trend that we'll talk about right after these important messages.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact. And we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Again, I was talking just a minute ago about the fact that reporters were able to obtain an internal Dallas Police Department memo that was suggesting that they would no longer be dispatching police officers to certain crimes. So that means you call 911 and say, somebody just broke into my vehicle. Well, we aren't necessarily going to come out and help you out there. You know, call your insurance company. Bye. Attempted car theft. Well, I'm sorry about that, but bye. Graffiti. Well, they painted graffiti on my garage. I'm sorry about that. But again, I don't know that we need to dispatch a police officer. And of course, this memo has been rescinded by the interim police chief, Lonzo Anderson. And of course, the incoming police chief, Eddie Garcia, knows nothing about it. But welcome to Dallas, Eddie, because it's going to be interesting. And you can understand the mindset behind some of this. I disagree with it, but I'm trying to help you understand that when KPMG was hired and took some time to try to figure out the 911 calls to Dallas, they found that very few of those ever resulted in arrests, and at least a third of them required a report. So it created lots of paperwork and didn't do anything to necessarily keep the residents of Dallas safe. And this comes at a time when I've got the numbers here. The number of homicides now for 2020 exceeds significantly the number of homicides in Dallas from 2019. And that, by the way, is an increase in homicides at a time when a lot of people technically were locked down during COVID. So you can see that an attempt to try to make Dallas the safest city in the country, which is the goal of the mayor, Eric Johnson, is maybe to try to establish a priority. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, first of all, it's the good example of what I've seen for decades now. I know when you do a broadcast for more than 30 years, you start to see a trend. And one of those trends is that in order to address crime, oftentimes what politicians did were decriminalize different kinds of activities. And it always is amazing to me. I was saying this in the 1990s and then even in the last couple of decades, that it's amazing that sometimes the crime rate has gone up when we've decriminalized so many different kinds of things which previously were crimes. And so that's been a tendency for some time. But what do you do, for example, when you see somebody trying to break into your car, somebody steals your hubcaps? What happens is if the police don't come out, I think you see the next step becomes vigilante justice, doesn't it? I mean, we are all aware of stories that have been told of individuals that camped out by their car and actually got the drop on an individual that was trying to steal their car, their hubcaps, or individuals that hooked up electrical, various kinds of things, or sirens, or all sorts of things to try to catch those individuals. Because if I can't depend on the police, if I call 911 and they say, well, it's your problem, not ours, well, people are going to take that into their own hands. That can very quickly get out of hand. I have not told this story in a couple of years, so it's worth telling again. It comes from my father-in-law. Up in Oregon, a farmer, and you've got farmers and cattlemen, and there was a story he was telling us of this one individual that got the drop on these cattle rustlers. Well, the high-tech cattle rustlers are doing it in a little different way. They would float a barge down this river, and since you would come to a place where cattle would go to the river to drink, there was no fences or anything there, so all he'd have to do is pull the barge up to where the cattle were, just load some cattle on the barge, and then just float down the river, and then put them in various trucks and haul them away. Well, the cattleman saw it happen, gets his rifle, and catches them in the act. So then, this is before the days of cell phones, he had to then march them up military style to the farmhouse, gets on the phone and calls. Now, we're out there in the country, folks, so you're not calling your local police officer, you're calling the county sheriff. And it's a big county. So he calls up the county sheriff's office and says, I've got 2 cattle rustlers here, and I need someone to come out here to put them in jail. the dispatcher, for some bizarre reason, said, well, he's on the other end of the county right now. It'll be a while before he can get there. And a moment of frustration, the cattleman said, let me just shoot them both. I'll leave them on the driveway. You can pick them up when you get time. He'll be right over. Now, of course, he wasn't going to do that, but you can understand how when you all of a sudden cannot depend on the police to actually come and provide any kind of protection, any kind of investigation, what happens. And so I know how well-meaning all of this seems, that we will no longer be dispatching police officers to burglary of a motor vehicle, attempted car theft, criminal mischief, reckless damage, graffiti, child custody interference. And, of course, that has been rescinded, and maybe they will see the error of their ways. But I am disturbed by the fact that as you're reading through all of this, you get this one comment from the interim police chief to say the memorandum was sent prematurely. So keep your eyes wide open, because you just don't know what's coming down next. And at a time when, of course, we aren't funding the police at a level that's probably appropriate, at a time when we have this kind of defund the police kind of mindset, it's not surprising to me that you're starting to find individuals giving counsel on saying maybe you shouldn't respond to every 911 call. And here are the criteria for whether you respond to a 911 call or don't. And it all kind of relates to a commentary I have coming out next week, but I'll give you a preview for it. And I've mentioned a little bit of it already here on the program. And that is, you've heard the whole slogan, defund the police. And so I saw a really good piece the other day from a man who calls himself a progressive. He believes that we should decriminalize marijuana. So again, there's that decriminalization. And he believes that we should expand the welfare state. And so he's a progressive. He lives in Seattle, but he also works in law enforcement. So he's been a cop for, a quarter of a century. But at the same time, I always love to use people like this who might be more inclined to maybe buy into a little of the defund the police rhetoric, and instead gives 4 very good arguments against it and takes on 4 myths. Real quickly, I'll go through each one of those. The first myth that he tackles is the idea that police are killing large numbers of citizens. That's not the case. Of course, we've quoted Heather McDonald and all sorts of other individuals that have very well documented that that's not true. He gives some numbers from New York City, but you can, of course, look at the national crime statistics to set that one aside. The second myth, which I appreciate him taking on, is this naive belief that the anti-cop movement, as he calls it, is largely peaceful. And, of course, he likens that to the Batman villain Two-Face. He says, the protests in the daytime were mostly examples of lawful free speech. But he then goes on to say that the dynamic changed dramatically at night as riots broke out. And you had this situation so many times when people would try to downplay what was taking place. And he even spent some time in the piece reminding us of how the mainstream media adopted what he comically called the false peaceful protest narrative, which, of course, is not true. His third one was one that he had personal experience with, the idea that abolishing police would lead to lawlessness. In other words, the police are the reason we have so many crimes, because they're actually stimulating the kind of reaction that we get. And, of course, he saw firsthand what happened in Seattle when you had the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone known as CHAZ. And when police were not allowed in the so-called protest zone, what happened? Well, lawlessness broke out, and he even gives you examples of some people that were killed during that period of time. And then his final myth is that the police are militarized. Not only has he been in law enforcement, but he's also actually a former soldier. And he says, I know what it was like to ride around in an armored vehicle, because our goal then in Iraq, Afghanistan, even as we maybe will talk about today with David French, who also served with distinguished action and valor in those areas, was to kill terrorists. But he said today SWAT team members use armored vehicles and armored clothing not to commit deadly force, but to try to avoid it. And he points out that oftentimes a SWAT team member wearing protection can actually wait longer before using deadly force because he or she is protected with that kind of material, unlike an officer who does not have those kind of protections. And so you can see, if nothing else, he really takes on each one of those myths. And I appreciate that, because we're going to hear more and more of people that maybe are saying, well, I don't necessarily mean to defund the police, but I mean we need to reduce the number of police officers, because we're convinced that if nothing else, they're the reason we have so much confrontation in the streets. The reality is, if nothing else, we probably need more cops on the beat, not less. A memo to the Dallas Police Force and the incoming police chief. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention, next hour we're going to have David French with us. Be talking about his book, which is entitled Divided We Fall, America's Succession, Threat, and How to Restore Our Nation. We don't have a common culture anymore. We're more divided than ever. And so we're going to be talking about that with him. And of course, I know he's going to have some comments about what is transpiring today in Georgia, what will be transpiring tomorrow with the count of the Electoral College vote, and also sorts of other issues, which are symptoms of the broader issues. So I really want to spend some time really just working our way through his book and acknowledging in many cases that much of what he is talking about are things we've chatted about with Jonathan Haidt and Rod Dreher and a variety of other individuals. So we'll get into all of those conversations with him. And then in the next hour at 2 o'clock, we'll have Victor Avila with us. We'll be talking about his Agent Under Fire book, Murder and a Manifesto, but also get into the issue of immigration and ICE and a number of other issues. You know, talking about defund the police, how about abolish ICE? So he'll have some comments about that as well. My commentary today is simply titled Turmoil, because we recognize that we are dealing with U.S. Senate elections today in Georgia. And I point out that usually a typical year, a runoff election for the U.S. Senate doesn't really even garner much interest from most Americans. But, of course, this is not a normal year. And 2021 is full of the same kind of turmoil that 2020 had. But in addition to the 2 U.S. Senate elections today in Georgia, is tomorrow the certification of the Electoral College vote. Again, I don't even know that we've ever covered that before on Point of View. Even when there were challenges, we knew that those were going to be set aside very quickly. And yet it's going to be something other than routine. It's going to be controversial. And again, this has not been a normal year in that regard. And you might remember the other day that we actually had Jim Dennison on, and he used the example, which I use in the piece as well, that last year really was just taking some of the worst things of previous years and packing them all into 2020. The year began with an impeachment. He said, reminds us of 1974. I also, in my commentary, add 1998. We had a pandemic that reminded us of 1918. There was the recession, which you could talk about in 2008 and 2009. And then we had street riots, not unlike what we had in 1968. And finally, a contested election like year 2000. So we packed about as much turmoil into 2020 as possible. But as we like to point out, it didn't end at December 31st. It continues even to this day. And when you look at the impact that this has had, the Census Bureau, for example, has been since March tracking America's income, and they found that nearly half of Americans have lost income since March. Of course, as we've talked about before, this oftentimes in many ways fell upon minorities and the poor. My commentary yesterday even went into that in some detail, as I quoted from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, saying that the majority of the 17 million households at risk of losing their homes primarily were poor people and people of color. And so this has been something that has been happening for some time. My commentary that will be actually later this week, I entitled it The Worst Year, because I pull some of that from Reed Wilson, who writes with some regularity in The Hill, in which he again documents, for example, the number of Americans that have lost their income, but then goes on and gives us all sorts of other facts as well. There are fewer jobs than there were 5 years ago. Nearly half of the tourism-related jobs in Hawaii have vanished. In some of the other states, the hospitality sectors have pretty much dropped and declined significantly. Then we have all the individuals that have fallen into poverty, about 8 million more individuals now below the poverty line since this time last year. And, of course, up until that time, the percentages of people falling into poverty have been decreasing each year. And now the individuals that are falling into poverty have actually been rising as a percentage every month since June. You also have, of course, the whole issue of evictions and things of that nature. Nearly a quarter of households that have not paid rent this month, and you can think of that through as well. And, of course, then we've talked about the economic impact of the lockdowns, but even the emotional impact of those as well. I've talked about in San Francisco, more people have died of drug overdoses than have died of the coronavirus. And so we get into something which I'm going to be talking about more maybe next week. because there are people that are trend watchers. One of those individuals is a man by the name of Brian Walsh. He writes for Axios. Before that, he was a correspondent for Time. He's not really looking at it from a Christian point of view, but it's interesting. His most recent book is called End Times, but it's not about end times prophecy. It's about just all the things that on the horizon are of concerns. And he's the kind of guy that's been writing about pandemics and economic dislocation and the rest. And he's been talking about this idea of the death spiral of public life. Because what you see is that the technology that we benefit from. I mean, so many of us right now, I'm not necessarily one of those, but so many of the people listening right now have been able to work from home. They've been able to be entertained at home because, after all, you don't really need to go to a movie theater anymore because you can stream just about anything you want. You can be fed at home. Yeah, you'd like to go to a restaurant, but you don't mind getting delivery to come to your home. And so he says what all this is going to have is perhaps toxic ramifications in the future because, after all, it's going to affect kind of the social, the economic, educational issues. And as a Christian, let me add one more. I think it also affects the spiritual implications because a lot of individuals I've run into haven't been to church in almost a year. And that's an issue as well. So then he starts talking about what this would happen to the cities, because cities right now are going to be devastated because they're finding out that 3 to 4 times more people will work remotely than before the pandemic. Right now in Midtown Manhattan, 14% of the office space is vacant. It's never been that bad since the 2009 economic depression or recession, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, you see all the public things which were in a death spiral. Public schools, frustrated parents take their kids out of school, maybe put them in Christian schools, home schools. Well, then the funding is based on a per-student basis is affected. And for that matter, state and local governments don't have as much money because revenues are down. Public transportation has been crippled because fewer and fewer people are riding these various buses, trains, and other things because more and more are working remotely. And, of course, the long-term impact, I would say, is just the issue of community. Something we'll be talking about with David French because, you know, bowling alone and loneliness and all those issues are going to be exacerbated. And so, again, when there's no community, when I don't even have to interface with another person, I don't even have to think about being tolerant, being civil, maybe being willing to compromise a little bit, that's not going to work well either. And so there are just a lot of issues that I think we're going to start identifying here in 2021. And that's why I hope you'll continue tuning in to Point of View. If you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to read a few of these articles that you've been quoting from, and in particular, I think you will really appreciate the piece by David French, not only his book, Divided We Fall, but Why Do They Hate Us? What is going to happen as Christians maybe become targets in 2021. You can find all of those on the website, pointofview.net. And, of course, we also have my Viewpoints commentary, which is entitled Turmoil. And if you'd like to read that or like to subscribe, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. When we come back, though, we're going to be talking with David French, senior editor for The Dispatch, author of a number of books, including this one, Divided We Fall. We'll talk with him right after this.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact. And we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. Pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and of course we'll be watching the 2 U.S. Senate elections in Georgia. Of course, tomorrow is the count on the Electoral College, and there's all sorts of controversy surrounding both of those. They're, in a sense, news pegs upon which we're going to hang our conversation this hour with David French. I've been promoting the fact that he would be here, and of course he was in studio with us last time, but he will be with us by phone as we talk about a book that was selected by World Magazine as their book of the year for understanding America. We have information about the book on the website, pointofview.net. We have a link to that one. A very good interview, which was done by our good friend Marvin Olasky with David French. And most importantly, we also have posted another article we might get to later, which will give you a connection to the French press. Why do they hate us? Race, Christian nationalism, white evangelical alienation from America. More to possibly cover than we can in 1 hour, but at least give you a chance to understand some of those issues. And David French, of course, is an individual that we've talked about, quoted from him quite often, as I've mentioned before. Senior editor at the Dispatch, a columnist for Time, graduate of the Harvard Law School, an individual that has fought for religious liberty, especially on college campuses over the years, was a senior writer for National Review, of course, author of this particular book, also a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, where he was awarded the Bronze Star. So, David French, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I was wondering, after looking at your Twitter post the other day, should I call you a dungeon master who creates a boundless world and I bind it by rules? You were using that to encourage people to use a photo from high school, and I thought that was pretty. And that was another aspect of your personality, which I didn't really know. So anyway, I thought I'd get you laughing as we get started here today.
Yeah, I was the nerd of all nerds in high school. So I was one of those guys that went to school with graph paper and a little felt bag that contained my 20-sided dice. So I was, yeah. So that
I did not know any of that.
That's how I walked through high school.
You can see I read your Twitter post, and if we had Shane Pruitt here right now, Shane Pruitt is one of our guys, which is part of our Millennial Roundtable, and he is convinced that the GOAT is LeBron James, and I saw one of your Twitter posts on that as well. But let's get into something maybe a little more serious, but no less controversial than who is the greatest athlete of all time in the NBA, and that is your book, because in some respects I wanted to focus on that first, and then we can get into the issues in the news that I think illustrate those. But as I read through this, we've had Rod Dreyer on. As a matter of fact, he was on last week, and he had him on back in October. And we've had Arthur Brooks on talking about the culture of contempt. We've had Jonathan Haidt on, the coddling of the American mind. In some respects, your book, which I commend to our listeners, pulls all of that together and helps us understand that we really are a house divided, aren't we?
Yeah, what I tried to do was take a lot of the research that has come from different strands and different folks, pull it all together and say, look, all of these things about the way in which we despise our political opponents, or the way in which we are grouping and living in like-minded communities, or the way in which we're becoming more and more politically extreme in our worldview, when you put all of these things together, they paint a very bad picture for the future of this country. And what I said in the very first paragraph of the book is that our continued unity cannot be guaranteed because there is no single truly important cultural, political, religious, or social force that is pulling us together more than it's pushing us apart.
Yes.
And so and it's not just politics, and that's something I really wanted to emphasize in the book. It's not just politics. Our politics are a symptom of a deeper malady in this country where we are culturally becoming very, very, and religiously becoming very, very different.
And again, we are a whole continent, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, and all of the rest. And so that's certainly one of those issues. And, of course, we've always been a melting pot people, but at the same time, the point that you're making is that there are these divisions. And I thought we'd look at it in two different ways. One, which would be geographically, because you talk about that in the first couple of chapters. And then something we just talked about even before you came on here, because the technology allows us to basically live in our little silos and things of that nature, there isn't any sense of community, and that's become worse under the pandemic. But what about geography? Because it does seem to me that there is a book that you also quote that I've done commentaries on, The Big Sort. And if you, like I did, grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and now I live in Dallas, I remember Michael Barone one time said that most people in the San Francisco Bay Area wouldn't consider living in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, even for much better money, and most Metroplexers wouldn't relocate to the Bay Area. And since I've lived in both, I could say that's probably true, although I am seeing a lot of people leaving California for Texas. But that that big sort, that geographical sort, which we see when we look at these electoral maps, recognizes how very different we are. And you live now in Tennessee, but you've lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you've interacted with people in New York City. And we've talked about Charles Murray. Some people live in this bubble, which is called Manhattan, or a bubble called Silicon Valley. Because of that, we're more divided than we've ever been before, aren't we?
Yeah, so there's two things happening at once, and you can't really understand the effect of the big sort without knowing about these two things. One is the thing that you said. It's we are tending to move to be around people of like mind. So what this means is that more and more of us live in what are called landslide counties. And a landslide county is one where one party or the other wins its presidential ballot by 20 points or more. In other words, completely grouped around people that agree with you, or largely grouped around people that agree with you. And so, but that by itself wouldn't be all that alarming if it wasn't for another phenomenon that happens. And this is really important to understanding our country. And that is something called the law of group polarization. This was a concept articulated by Cass Sunstein more than 20 years ago. And it's really profoundly true in its description of human nature. And what it is it says that when people of like mind gather, they tend to become more extreme.
Yes.
Here's a good way of thinking about it. Let's say that you go to dinner and everyone you're at dinner with is supportive of gun rights, and you start talking about gun control, and you're discussing gun control efforts, and they're making you upset. You're not going to leave the dinner less supportive of gun rights. You're more supportive. Or, here's another simple way of putting it. How many of you have gone to a really good Bible study, a really good one, and left it loving Jesus less? When you gather in like-minded circles, you become more committed to a cause. And so what ends up happening is, if just do the math, if you have different people in different parts of the country who are increasingly of like mind, they're going to become more committed and more extreme. And you see this in American politics. It used to be we had this huge middle, where
Right.
most people were. And now that big bell curve is flattening out.
Sure
and that's
is.
one of the things that causes so much anger and political fury in this country.
Well, again, a lot of that's in Chapter 5 of the book. We'll come back and explain a little bit more about the law of group polarization right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today, there are 2 U.S. Senate elections in Georgia. Of course, you know that because they will likely determine the direction of the U.S. Senate and the country. In past years, a runoff election for the U.S. Senate did not garner much attention from most Americans, but this has not been a normal year. And this year of 2021 is starting off with even more turmoil. In addition to these 2 U.S. Senate elections in Georgia today is the certification of the Electoral College votes tomorrow. In past years, this has been routine and rarely controversial, but this has not been a normal year for elections. When you think back to last year, you see lots of examples of turmoil that reminded us of previous years. For example, the year began with an impeachment that reminded us of 1974 or even 1998. Then we had a pandemic that reminded us of 1918. That was followed by a recession that exceeded what took place in 2008. Then we had street riots like those in 1968. And finally, we had a contested election like the year 2000. We have managed to pack as much turmoil into one year as anyone could possibly imagine, and the beginning of 2021 looks like more turmoil could be on the way. When the Census Bureau started to track Americans' income, they concluded that nearly half had lost income since March. As I mentioned yesterday, much of the impact has fallen on the minorities and the poor. Will America get back to normal very soon? We certainly hope so, but the economic impact will follow these families into the year for many months. This is a time to remind each other that God is sovereign and in control, even when things look out of control. Christians in previous centuries have lived through much worse than what we are facing, and they learned to trust in God and be faithful witnesses. We must do the same. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with David French, again, a columnist and a writer, but also, of course, the author of the book, Divided We Fall, America's Succession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. And I know, David, that oftentimes when you speak to a group, you say, if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this obscure academic paper written by Cass Sunstein, who, of course, was a law professor in Chicago. Gotta love somebody that knows who he is, if nothing else. The Law of Group Polarization. And I think we've seen this in so many dynamics, because if you go to a political meeting, since I'm a precinct chairman, I see those, it's sometimes the loudest person in the room that's saying, we need to go out and fight these individuals. And after a while, everybody shakes their heads, and there's never sort of a moderating tone in any of that. And there used to be a time in which, not so long ago, Republicans and Democrats might argue with each other in the floor of the Senate or in Congress, but then go out to dinner with each other afterwards. That just doesn't seem to be happening anymore, does it?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that the data shows that people, your average Republican, not just your politician, but your average Republican and your average Democrat dislike each other more and more every year. And this is not something that just started during the Trump administration. This is something that's been going on for years and years and years, a slow build of mutual partisan animosity. And then as that has happened, the potential or ability to compromise in the legislature has been decimated, because if you really and truly dislike your political opponents to your core, well, you don't want to compromise with them. And it has created a very different dynamic in Washington. Think of it like this. When Ronald Reagan was sworn in, he did not have a Republican House. He didn't have one. But he had what they would call a working majority, because enough Democrats would compromise and vote with Republicans to get a lot of Reagan's legislative agenda, including his big sweeping tax cuts, through Congress. And so there was an ability to compromise. There was an ability to reach accommodations to govern the country. And so now what we have is a situation where compromise itself is seen as weakness. And so you're going to be constantly vulnerable to a primary challenger if you compromise at all. And then the reality is government becomes deeply stagnated, because without any ability to compromise, the only way to really run the country is if you had unified control. But the country is so closely divided that unified control is extremely elusive and often temporary. And so we just ping-pong back and forth between stagnation and these very brief moments of unified control, and it's very difficult to deal with, to actually govern the country in a sensible way.
Well, and the other way, which doesn't bode well, is what is happening to the younger generation. I know you're very familiar with the coddling of the American mind because you and Greg are best of friends. We've had Jonathan Haidt on, and one of the untruths is not just that the people that are against us are wrong, but they're evil. In other words, when you start saying that I may disagree with you, and we've had Alan Dershowitz on this program, Jonathan Haidt, we can think of Jordan Peterson, we can think of all sorts of individuals that would be your classical liberal who would say, look, I may disagree with your view, but I defend the right of you to say that. That's not, as you well know, having spent so much time on college campuses defending Christians, is not what the left is saying. And so that's been sort of the left mantra for now quite some time. But the other part that you point out in the book, it's also becoming the mantra of the kind of the extreme right, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, we're beginning to see there's this thing called horseshoe theory, and in horseshoe theory, it's where the extremes come closer together. As you get more extreme, you actually become more closer together. So there is very much a cancel culture that exists on the left, for example. You see it on college campuses. This is the kind of acts of intimidation and censorship that I litigated against for 20-plus years in my legal career. So you see a cancel culture that exists. Well, there's a cancel culture on the right as well, for now mainly centered around Donald Trump and opposition to Donald Trump. But you're beginning to see many of the same maladies on the right that you saw on the left. And here's what's happening. There's sort of a deeper thing going on culturally. It's not an exclusive left-wing phenomenon. I was in a meeting not long ago, a couple of years ago, with some very leading pastors, people who pastored megachurches, who had very large public platforms. And a number of them said this very interesting thing. They said, we're noticing amongst our young people a real change. And that change is 10, 15, 20 years ago, you and I could disagree about ideas and still love each other as people and be friends. We're seeing that going away, and that the disagreement over ideas was taken as a personal insult. And so, for example, I've for years had a sort of a framework in the way I engage in discourse. Is I try as much as possible to attack ideas and not people. But then what I found increasingly in recent years is if I take and attack an idea, a lot of people take that as a personal insult. Mm-hmm. And so you're seeing this increased prevalence of people saying that even disagreeing with me is like a personal attack and acting accordingly. And it's one of the reasons why our discourse is so toxic.
The other part of that, which you've identified as well, is the tendency, especially when you have these two extremes, to pick out some bizarre comment that the other side has used and use that to, in a sense, paint the entire movement with a broad brush. Now, the sad reality is so much of that happens on cable news and even in Twitter and all sorts of other places, when I find that, to use an illustration, there's a camp to the left, a camp to the right. There's a mass of Americans in the middle, and they're watching these kind of verbal barbs fly over the head from one to the other. And most of the people I run into that listen to this program are saying, you know, I don't necessarily like that side, but I'm not real thrilled with what's supposed to be my side on the other side either. And that is being perpetuated because, after all, you want people's eyeballs both in front of a screen to watch the cable news networks and also in front of a screen to see what's on Twitter, Facebook, or whatever. And that's, I think, made the problem that already existed worse. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's only a minority of Americans that are truly engaged in politics and truly sort of stay aware of politics. Now, the majority of Americans are not that engaged in politics. Now, that doesn't mean they're moderate, because some of the people who are not engaged in politics are quite conservative or quite liberal. But the majority of Americans are not engaged in politics. And you pointed to something really interesting. There's some research I point out in the book that this majority of Americans who do not engage in politics they've got a name. They're called the exhausted majority.
Right.
Why are they exhausted? Because they're alienated from the political culture that exists, that is so toxic and is so partisan. Now, at the end of the day, most of that exhausted majority will go vote. And they'll go vote for, you know, according to, if they're Republican, they'll vote Republican. If they're Democrat, they'll vote Democrat. But they'll be upset about it the whole time because they don't like the choices offered to them. They don't like the discourse. But the key word here, one of the reasons why this exhausted majority has not sort of changed the political culture away from being so toxic and angry, the key word is exhausted, not majority. They're not engaged. They don't demand better because they just pull away. And so what ends up happening is they leave the field to the most angry, energetic people on both sides. And here's the crazy thing about this angry, energetic, engaged group of people. They're the ones who are the most wrong about their political opponents. It turns out that the more political media you consume, the more wrong you are about the beliefs of your opponents. You tend to believe they're far more extreme than they really are. And that goes back to this phenomenon you talked about at the very beginning, which is one of the things that political media does is it picks out the craziest person or the angriest person from the other side and says, see, this is what they're really like. When they really might be an outlier as opposed to a representative of the other side. And when you do that enough, everyone's going to think that the craziest fringe people are exactly what they're really like. And it creates this, you know, cascading sense of alarm that's often completely unjustified.
Very good. We're going to take a break, but I remember in a commentary that you wrote a while back, it also said that we used to depend on these well-educated individuals to kind of lead us forward, the people that were more engaged. But now we're finding that the people that are more engaged have a more distorted view of reality, and that doesn't bode well for the future. So what does that mean? Because the second part of his book talks about, what about the possibility of dissolution? You know, could California or Texas or something like that actually separate from the rest of the United States? Again, that's kind of hypothetical, but it illustrates, again, the subtitle of the book. And so we're going to spend some time talking with David French about that. And then we'll see if we can apply some of these principles to some of the things we see happening right before our very eyes. All that coming up right after this.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact. And we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with David French as we talk about his book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession, Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. And David, I guess maybe it would be good to talk about the middle section of your book because, as you've pointed out, there's really no cultural, religious, political, or social force that's pulling us together. There are those that are pushing us apart. Some people might just be tempted to say, well, we'll just muddle through, but you raise the possibility, more hypothetically, of what if California left the Union? I mean, after all, people I've run into sometimes say, well, if California left the United States, it's no big deal. I'm going, yes, it is. It'd be the fifth largest country in the world by GDP if it were to leave. Texas, you take chapters on California, Texas. We have listeners in both of those states as well as 36 other states around the country. And what you point out in sort of a hypothetical way is the cost. And I had thought about some of it, but you go into some more detail, which illustrates, again, we just can't continue down this road, can we?
Yeah, the middle chapters are really the key of the book, and they're fictional scenarios, Cal-exit and Texit, how a progressive government would secede in California, a conservative government would secede in Texas and a bunch of other southern and midwestern states. Because my point is this, is that we are not immune from the laws of history and politics and culture. You cannot continue to separate and divide without consequence. And what ends up happening is, look at it like this. Imagine that with every year that ticks by where we increasingly separate and divide and hate each other more, it's like putting another piece of kindling on a bonfire that hasn't been lit yet. And so the more kindling and the more fuel that's put on this bonfire before it's lit means the smaller the spark or the smaller the flame needed to light it all up. And, one of the things, I finished this book in March, is when it was, you get the final page proofs and everything. And the pandemic comes along right as I'm finishing the book. And one of the interesting questions that people asked me as I was writing it was, do you think if we face a big national crisis in America, we'll become more united or less united? Because for years and years and years in the U.S., when we faced a big national crisis, we got more united. We were more united after 9/11. We were more united during Desert Storm. We were more united after the Challenger disaster, for example. I mean, you can go through recent American history, and big events united us. Has that happened in the pandemic? No.
Nope.
In fact, the opposite. We're more divided, far more divided than we've been. And so my point in the middle chapters is to say, look, it's easy to imagine how if we continue to divide, it's not saying right away, it's not saying tomorrow or next year, but if we keep going the way we're going and there's an unusual kind of spark applied, that it could start to blaze out of control pretty quickly. And that's just because we're not immune from the forces of history. We never have been. We're not special like that. We're just people, and people who get bitterly divided sometimes want to separate.
So at least as a possibility, which brings us, of course, to the third section, chart James Madison's course. And, I was thinking about that. Of course, you mentioned Federalist Paper number 10, which, James Madison was talking about even then when he's writing the Federalist Papers about factions and all sorts of issues. But you take on this issue of pluralism and tolerance. I like to oftentimes use the word civility because tolerance has been so redefined, but it's the idea that you and I may disagree, but we still treat each other with some level of graciousness and civility. I'm trying to encourage Christians to be the best citizens and to be the most gracious citizens possible, because in our society today, with a cancel culture and this kind of judgmentalism, we're going to have to set a better example. But nevertheless, that's kind of the way forward if we want to prevent the dissolution you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. One of the things that really is frustrating if you pay attention to American politics is a lot of people are selling the public a fool's gold. And that fool's gold is, if you follow me, we're going to win, and we're going to keep winning. And we're going to win, and we're going to win, and we're going to win. And that's how we're going to end this threat that we perceive from our political opponents, is we're just going to keep on winning. And that's just wrong. There's no evidence for the proposition that the way our system is built and the way our demographics the demographics of America, the reality of America is that we're going to be a very closely divided country from now and for a very long time. And so anyone who's telling you the way to deal with all this is we'll just beat the bad guys, they're part of the problem, because the other side looks at that and says, look at what a threat those people are. Here's what's really interesting about American culture wars, and Christian listeners in particular are often really shocked when they hear this. But you won't be shocked if you have a lot of progressive friends. So if you're a conservative Christian, you're used to sort of say, hey, we're losing the culture wars, everything's running against us. But it might surprise you that you can go to secular progressive gatherings, and they're saying, we're losing, everything's going against us. Both sides think they're losing. That's one of the reasons why people are so up in arms, is both sides think they're losing in very important ways, and both sides think the other side has won these really, really big victories. And so that shocks people who are conservatives, because they say, no, we're the ones who are on the out. We're the ones who are in decline. We're the ones who have to fight back so hard through politics just to keep our place. And then you'll hear the exact opposite, or the exact sentiment from folks on the left. They say, no, we're the ones on the defensive. All of the structures advantage the conservatives. And you think, wait a minute, what's going on? They can't both be right, can they? Well, they're both right in some important respects. And so the way through this is not to say, well, we're going to beat them, we're going to dominate them. The way through this is to say we have to rediscover the vision of the founders, which was that a variety of points of view are accommodated. We can all exist in this republic together. I don't have to win to have a home in this land. And neither does the other side have to win to have a home in this land. That we can in James Madison's Federalist Number 10 talks about dealing with the danger of violent factions,
right,
by providing a home for many factions in this country.
And again, if nothing else, it illustrates the point that I've made before. Back in the 1980s, I first saw that because I used to actually not only get mailings from the Moral Majority, but from the ACLU. And I used to say I could put the two next to each other. And if you just change the names, for ACLU, it's the dangers of Ronald Reagan and Jesse Helms. And for the Moral Majority, it was the dangers of Ted Kennedy. Well, all you have to do is update those now. It's Donald Trump and it's Chuck Schumer and all the rest. And we're in the process of saying we're losing. Instead, we have to recognize we're all there together, but there are some real significant issues we need to address. And so I thought maybe for a minute, since we're talking about the Christian response, your piece that we've also posted, Why Do They Hate Us? You've been on college campuses long before I did this. I spent lots of time speaking on college campuses. And what we found is that most university professors probably feared the so-called evangelical right more than anyone else. And they've passed that on now to an entire generation, couple of generations of young people. And so now they've found their way not just into the government, but as we've talked about with Rod Dreyer, in terms of kind of a soft totalitarianism, you get they're showing up in the NFL and the NBA, and they're showing up in corporations, and they're showing up in big tech and a variety of other things. And so as a result, Christians are going to be probably also targeted, and there's going to be a need for us to understand the world that we find ourselves in here in the 21st century, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things you have to be very careful about, the American Christians, and I'm speaking here mainly, and this is just the reality of the demographics, white evangelicals, which is the big bulk of the evangelical base of the Republican Party, have to be very, very careful the extent to which you identify yourself so completely as a partisan of one party or the other. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Not one party in the United States of America has a political platform that's divinely inspired. The political platforms of our parties, some of them there's some virtues in them, and there are some aspects of them that are perhaps unjust or downright destructive. And what the research is showing is that there is increasingly no daylight at all between the beliefs and attitudes of white evangelicals and beliefs and attitudes of Republicans. White evangelicals are Republicans, Republicans are white evangelicals. And why is this dangerous? Why is this bad? Because if you start to identify so completely with a political party, you will start to put a religious fervor behind political positions that are not necessarily mandated by your faith. And that starts to be a real problem. And in this article you referenced, I talked about, why do they hate us? And a lot of Christians like to say, well, it's because of my views on life. But it's not actually that reason in many cases. And that's quite interesting and dangerous, I believe.
We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue for a few more minutes with David French. And David, I thought we might just talk about a couple of these watershed events, because you mention them in your book. And just the other day, of course, we had Rod Dreyer on. As a matter of fact, I might just mention for our listeners that Kelly Shackelford, who joins us on Friday, he and his wife have been doing kind of a book study on Live Not by Lies, and that's tonight Facebook at 8 o'clock. Just go to Standing Firm, Live Not by Lies. You'll find it there. I've been enjoying that. But he talks about the watershed of what took place in Indiana when trying to simply implement the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was not very controversial and was implemented in the 1990s. Sponsors like Ted Kennedy and Chuck Schumer and even the ACLU endorsed it. But then when it tried to be implemented years later in Indiana, just the whole corporate culture came down upon Indiana, including Governor Mike Pence, who of course now is our vice president. And in your chapter, you also talk about immigration. I'm going to be talking with an individual next hour in studio who actually was almost murdered by the drug gangs as a border patrol agent. And you mention also California, which is implementing all sorts of laws that basically said we're not going to actually follow the federal government in terms of immigration. So whether you take the example that Rod Dreyer uses of what happens when the corporate world, the private sector, if you will, comes down upon us or individuals that want to do the right thing, or when you have the government, I'll use the California example, wants to simply change the laws, we've got a lot of work to do, because these two examples that you use in your book illustrate the fact that we have people that aren't really necessarily following the rule of law anymore and actually accusing people of being bigots if they just simply want to follow the rule of law.
Yeah, and this is a bipartisan problem. I mean, right now we have people not refusing to follow the rule of law regarding a presidential election and calling people cowards if they want to follow the rule of law. It's a really scary time in this country for the way in which people take an outcome-based approach to law. That, in essence, I'm going to agree and comply with only the laws that I like, or I'm going to agree with and comply with only the election outcomes that I like. And if I don't like that particular law, if I don't like that particular outcome, then I'm going to do everything that I have that is within my power, sometimes even lawful or not lawful, to undermine it. And one of the things that I talked about in the book is one of our ways through this problem is what I call a healthy federalism. And that means that we have to allow California to be California, and we have to allow Tennessee to be Tennessee. I'm here in Tennessee. So you have to allow these states to create governmental structures and advance political values that mirror the values of the people of the state, but without depriving any given individual within the state of their fundamental rights under the Constitution. Because the old bad federalism of pre-Civil War and Jim Crow permitted states to violate the rights of their citizens. And so what we have to do is we have to have a federalism that protects individual liberty that's in the Bill of Rights and in the Civil War amendments. We have to protect individual liberty, but we've got to allow these states to kind of go their own way on different policies and procedures. And one of the things that's frustrating, if you are a constitutional conservative, as I've long been, what you realize is that there's not really that many people who are truly committed to these constitutional structures.
No.
They use them as a tactic, not as a principle. And so when Republicans are in power, they like to override the Democratic-controlled states. When Democrats are in power, they like to override Republican-controlled states. This is something we've been seeing year after year after year, and it has to stop, because what happens is when we centralize all of that power in the federal government, at the same time that our nation is becoming more diverse politically, more diverse ethnically, more diverse religiously, those two things are incompatible. And what ends up happening is it raises the stakes of every presidential election so much in people's minds, because there's more power that's accumulated to the president, even though the nation itself is getting more diverse. It's less susceptible to being led by one ideological movement, and it needs to be led by multiple ideological movements that better reflect the actual reality of the country itself.
You know, your last chapter, Federalism Ends Where the Bill of Rights Begins, it gets us into that where do we draw the line question. And I'll be the first to admit it's a little bit gray, but it seems to me that tax policies, different states can have different tax policies. Some have a property tax, most have a property tax, some have a state income tax, some don't have an income tax, some have sales tax. And I think that kind of pluralism and federalism works pretty well. Frankly, even though you and I believe in the Second Amendment, I recognize that you have some states that have constitutional carry, concealed carry. Others have very restrictive laws. But I don't think you could have different laws related to marriage, and that's what really got into the Marriage Protection Act, or, of course, another issue that you and I think very highly of, the whole idea of pro-life. So there seems to be some places where federalism really does need to take place. There are going to be different ways to address education and different ways to fund the government within the states. But you can't have total pluralism because, as you said, Bill of Rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, somewhere along the line we need to draw those lines. So that's kind of the next challenge for us in the 21st century, isn't it?
Yeah, one of the things is that you're never going to have a conflict-free society. Any utopianism should be looked at with deep suspicion. We're never going to have a system that makes everybody happy. And I like the way the pseudonymous writer Scott Alexander described pluralism or classical liberalism. He said it's the best Civil War avoidance mechanism ever designed by the mind of man, because essentially what classical liberalism, that would be the small L liberalism of the founders, that's the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the Civil War amendments, what they are essentially saying is you can have a place here. Your fundamental rights, even when you lose elections, your fundamental rights will not be infringed. And so, yes, you're right. I think states should have an enormous amount of latitude on tax policy, on education policy, on climate policy, energy policy. But when it comes to, if I cross the state line from Tennessee into Kentucky, do I have substantially fewer rights to free speech or religious freedom or due process of law? That's drawing the line that crosses over that fundamental social compact.
Well, again, 22 chapters, and I didn't try to cover all of those, but I wanted people to know about the book. Again, congratulations that World Magazine and our good friend Marvin Olasky picked it as the book of the year for Understanding America. But we also, David, have a link to thedispatch.com, and I would certainly encourage people to find some of those articles that you have written. And we've also posted one, Why Do They Hate Us? And it will take you a while to read through that. I think it's about 10 or 12 pages that I printed out, but some great material so that people will have a more thoughtful understanding of what is happening in our culture. And I appreciate you writing the book, and I really appreciate you giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Looking forward to the next opportunity. David French with us, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about the whole issue of what is taking place at our border. Victor Avila is actually a retired special agent who was with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We hear people talking about abolish ICE. Okay, we're going to talk about that, which he was nearly killed. His partner was, and so we'll talk about that. But also, he has run for city council. Want to talk about some of those issues. Been involved in a committee that has been looking at some of the things being taught in the schools. So he brings quite a bit to the table, and I think if nothing else, you will appreciate these conversations as well. If you find yourself wanting to know a little bit more about David French, we have information about the book. It's available both on hardback and in Kindle. We have, of course, his article, Why Do They Hate Us?, and a link to the Dispatch. And, of course, my commentary is there today. So we will take a break, and when we come back, Victor Avila will be in studio with us, and we look forward to that conversation right after these important messages.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact. And we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking about border security. We're going to be talking about immigration. We're going to be talking about human trafficking, even all sorts of other issues related to that, because we're going to be telling the story that is in this new book, which is entitled Agent Under Fire, A Murder and a Manifesto. It is a tragic story, to put it mildly, because sitting across from me is Victor Avila, who was, of course, a supervisory special agent with the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He's worked, of course, with Homeland Security. He's worked with Customs. Even before that, he was a U.S. probation officer. And we are going to be talking about the fact that he was ambushed and his partner was killed and he nearly died himself. And it's an incredible article, really a book with a series of articles that I've had a chance to read even before the book came out. But now the book's out, you would really want to get a copy of it. We have a link to it on the website. You can get it in paperback or also in hardcover. And I think you're going to really appreciate what he has been through. But we're also going to expand that, because not only has he actually worked in that area with ICE, but he also has run for office and ran for city council, and also has been involved in a committee looking at what's being taught in the schools, which I think will bother you as well. So we have lots of things to talk about. So, Victor, thank you very much for joining us today here in studio.
Thank you for having me, Kerby.
I've watched you on television. I've seen other people do interviews with you. This is the first time I've met you. I think you've been in the studio once before because we had you kind of in a round table. But for most of our people that are listening right now, they're going to be hearing this incredible story of a young man who I think you described yourself as always saw yourself as Hispanic American or Mexican American, with emphasis on the American part, right?
That's absolutely true. I'm a first generation Mexican American, Hispanic, but I consider myself a patriot and definitely an American first. With my doesn't mean I ignore my culture or anything like that, but definitely proud to be an American.
Yes. And in some respects, you, because of that, wanted to serve the country. And we got a picture. As a matter of fact, you were talking about this one picture here, which I guess is a little bit dated, but that's when you actually got your badge, right?
That's right.
And that was with the Treasury Department. So give us a little bit of the background, because your book goes into this in terms of born in the United States and then eventually becoming an agent. But before we get into trafficking and smuggling and then the attack on you, give us a little bit of the background story. I'd love to hear that.
So I started my law enforcement career as a state parole officer after graduating from the University of Texas at El Paso. Then worked there as a state parole officer, then moved up to the federal service, what we call the United States Probation Office. When U.S. parole is abolished, so it's called U.S. probation for the U.S. courts. Learned that part of our justice system, the second half, which we realize as an agent that's really when things begin, when you slap cuffs on someone. Mm-hmm. And so after doing that about 5 years, I really realized I wanted to be the investigator, the criminal investigator that conducts these investigations. And so back then, the Department of Homeland Security was just being created. And it was created in 2003, and that's the same time that I was applying for the U.S. Customs Service as a special agent. Eventually, the merger happened between the U.S. Customs Service and the old Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, and which now we know as ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Right.
And so I went through the difficulties and the growing pains of a new agency. And so learning not just the U.S. Customs portion of it, which, by the way, a lot of people still, they kind of ignore when you hear the word ICE. They immediately just think it's immigration. But the U.S. Customs Service does many, many more investigations and that touch our borders or has any nexus to our border. And so eventually we got the name ICE and an ICE badge. And now it's actually to create a better identity for the criminal investigators, their Homeland Security Investigations, HSI agents.
Yes. Well, again, we have a lot of information about you on our website, and if people want to read all of it, it's incredible. But let's, if we can, talk about what is happening at the border, because you have a chapter here about smuggling, you have a chapter on trafficking, and when we talk about trafficking, oftentimes we talk about human trafficking, but there's also gun trafficking, there's smuggling, there's all sorts of commercial fraud, there's even counterterrorism. Kind of give us a feel for what all that entails, because I don't know how those few agents out there like you try to cover that incredible landscape of all those different threats to our country.
Absolutely true, and that's exactly what it is a threat. And I believe right now they're imminent threats to the United States, and the border security is now national security issues. That's really what it comes down to, and it has to deal with the condition that Mexico is in. And I'm talking about the cartels. Right. I'm talking about the illegal activity that's happening that comes through our border. Now, our border has become better secure in the last years, but it's still not secure. The wall is, I write about a chapter about the wall. It helps, the barrier there, and I hope it continues to be built, even though Joe Biden has said that he possibly will stop the construction of the wall. But those are tools that our men and women of the Border Patrol and down there need. And so the illegal activity continues. Right now, we have seen a record numbers of seizures of methamphetamine and fentanyl. Those drugs, that poison gets to our communities all around the United States. The cartels are present in these communities and pushing their products. And what happens is that also brings the violence. And we've seen the spike of violence this past year in so many cities around our country. And a lot of that violence and a lot of that criminal activity is linked back to the drug cartels, which I write in the book as well as possible foreign, should be designated as foreign terrorist organizations. So I believe that's what they are.
I was going to get to that in just a minute, because in some respects we're dealing with, and I don't want to call Mexico a failed state, but certainly one where the cartels control a lot more. And even as you were shot, we'll get to this in just a minute, you're not sure if the person coming to help you has been compromised by the cartels. So when I have a police officer come to my house, I'm assuming that they are wanting to look out for the best interest of me, and yet at the border, you can't make that kind of assumption. And so in some respects, they really are like a terrorist group in the Middle East, but instead they're not in the Middle East, they're right there on our border, both inside the United States and on the other side of that wall, aren't they?
Absolutely. And about Mexico being a failed state, they're very close. Yeah. Very close. By their own statistic, the cartels have a direct influence or impact on 80% of their country. You cannot come nowhere near the border on the Mexican side and not be encountered by cartel members. Now, when we're talking about human smuggling, human trafficking, intellectual property rights, everything that these guys, these organizations want to bring through illicitly through our border. Other things that we have to look at and not ignore, for example, right now when we've seen the vaccines coming over, that's another thing that Homeland Security investigates is those those possible frauds in
yeah.
pharmaceuticals,
fake vaccines,
and many, many other things.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, might as well get into the core of the book. I want to take you back to Highway 57, and it is an incredible story, so we'll let him tell the story. And, of course, then we're going to get into the implications of all of that, and we're going to open up the phones because I suspect many of you have comments about border security, comments or questions about immigration policy, customs, and the rest. And especially if we are going to have a change of administrations, what does that mean? And I know Victor can address that because I've seen him on television doing so. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today, there are 2 U.S. Senate elections in Georgia. Of course, you know that because they will likely determine the direction of the U.S. Senate and the country. In past years, a runoff election for the U.S. Senate did not garner much attention from most Americans, but this has not been a normal year. And this year of 2021 is starting off with even more turmoil. In addition to these 2 U.S. Senate elections in Georgia today is the certification of the Electoral College votes tomorrow. In past years, this has been routine and rarely controversial, but this has not been a normal year for elections. When you think back to last year, you see lots of examples of turmoil that reminded us of previous years. For example, the year began with an impeachment that reminded us of 1974 or even 1998. Then we had a pandemic that reminded us of 1918. That was followed by a recession that exceeded what took place in 2008. Then we had street riots like those in 1968. And finally, we had a contested election like the year 2000. We have managed to pack as much turmoil into one year as anyone could possibly imagine, and the beginning of 2021 looks like more turmoil could be on the way. When the Census Bureau started to track Americans' income, they concluded that nearly half had lost income since March. As I mentioned yesterday, much of the impact has fallen on the minorities and the poor. Will America get back to normal very soon? We certainly hope so, but the economic impact will follow these families into the year for many months. This is a time to remind each other that God is sovereign and in control, even when things look out of control. Christians in previous centuries have lived through much worse than what we are facing, and they learned to trust in God and be faithful witnesses. We must do the same. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Everyone, again, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Phone call coming in. We'll probably get a few more in just a minute. And we will get into what's happening at our border. Just the other day, you had all these Cubans at the border. They're racing in past the border security, shouting, Biden, Biden. And so we want to get into what is going to be happening possibly in the future. And, of course, we will get into that. But I thought for just a minute, Victor, let's tell your story, because that's really the core of the book. Agent Under Fire, a Murder and a Manifesto. And if people want to hear the story, it's the middle chapters. But if they are concerned about immigration or even what we can do, you have a whole section here on a plan to strengthen our border security. So we'll get to that, and I'm sure some of our callers want to ask questions about that. But take us back to Highway 57. You and your partner, who actually died, were attacked by one of these groups. These cartels are so ruthless. But just tell us the story, if you might. It's pretty riveting when I begin to go through it and look at it in the book.
Yes, the attack occurred on February 15, 2011. We're coming up on the 10th year anniversary. We were on assignment. I was officially assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. Right. Special Agent Jaime Zapata was on a temporary assignment, and we were given an order or an assignment to drive from Mexico City towards Monterrey to meet with our other ICE agents, counterparts from the Monterrey office, to pick up some equipment. We did that on the even though I had challenged the assignment because there was back then the Zetas cartel controlled that whole corridor.
That's right.
And we had that intelligence, and we knew that there was a lot of firefights that they were having between the police and the military. And unfortunately, my supervisors ignored that intelligence and
after the fact, they said they did probably not treat you right, which is sad.
Right.
Yeah.
The aftermath is definitely a second story to the shooting. And but we were ordered, and so we went off in my armored Suburban, and we did the exchange approximately 6.5 hour drive from Mexico City. On the way back, stopped and ate lunch, and that's when I handed the keys over to Special Agent Jaime Zapata so he could take over the drive. I was working on my BlackBerry back then, and within 15 minutes of him driving, we were blocked in by 2 SUVs full of armed Zeta cartel members, and forced us off the road. Eventually, through a lot of the commotion, one of the armored window of my side was rolled down a couple of inches. They were able to introduce an AK-47 and a handgun, and without warning, they opened fire. I during the whole stop, I yelled at them in Spanish that we were Americans, that we were U.S. Embassy employees, that we were diplomats, that this was a diplomatic vehicle with diplomatic plates. And ironically, they actually corroborated that story in 2017. They were captured and extradited and tried in the U.S., and they actually testified to the fact that they heard me, that they knew we were Americans, and they still decided to open fire.
Yeah. Well, and you pulled your head back by the metal part there, but nevertheless, it killed your friend, your other agent, and you find yourself in the hospital. They want to give you painkiller, and you're going, I don't, first of all, want to take anything because they might put me out. And then you're trying on your cell phone to get a trusted person to come. So explain that for just a minute, because for most of us, we assume that when the police comes, they have our best interest at heart. But it's quite possible that those individuals that came to, quote, help you were there to kill you. What about that?
Absolutely true. I was shot 3 times. Agent Zapata was also unresponsive at that point. We were in the middle of Highway 57, and I called for help. And there's a call; people can listen to it online. Or I called the U.S. Embassy hotline.
Right.
But I then also called the head of our vetted unit, the federal police, to send help, and he sent the one trusted person that was head of a group that would be able to rescue us. This is how deep the corruption is in Mexico.
That's just sad.
But while we were there on the highway, you alluded to there was individuals. One was a marked unit, a federal police marked unit that slowed down and passed by. And I thought this was going to be our first rescue, but that police officer did not stop. The second one was an ambulance, or what appeared to be an ambulance, that stopped on the right shoulder, and I could see an individual come over and try to open the door. And I refused to open the door because at that point I didn't trust anyone. Well, it turned out in the trial, it came out and that ambulance was actually the cartel's ambulance and their own rescue that they use for when their individuals are shot. And so they were there just to finish me off. And that was my biggest fear, going to the hospital, because I knew for sure. I've investigated these cases where the cartel members will go to the hospitals and make sure that if they have any survivors, they'll kill them there. And that's why I refused any kind of medication initially, because I didn't want to, be under the influence of any drug. And they didn't know exactly who we were. I didn't identify myself on purpose to secure our safety.
Well, if you would like to join the conversation, we would certainly welcome your phone calls. So let's take some phone calls, and along the way, we're going to get into some other aspects of that because, indeed, we have some changes in administration. We also have some challenges at the border. So if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's go first to Oklahoma, KJDR. Jim, thank you for calling. You're on with Victor.
Yes, I'm glad to talk with him. I've been following your conversation very closely because I did, as I told your screener, missionary flying down there from Canada to Costa Rica, and then recently I drive trucks, drive cars, drive whatever needs to be taken south as a transmigrante. So he was talking, or you were talking about the fact that it was maybe a failed state. I talked to a lot of people up here, and mostly Mexicans, because the vast majority of Mexican people are really wonderful people.
Sure.
I mean, they will help you out with anything.
Yes.
So I tell them, Mexico is not a country. It's a cesspool, and too many of them don't really know what the word does. So I explain, yada yada yada. So, but anyway, I'm interested in just listening to your conversation about the ambush and not being, not taking drugs and things, or probably sedatives or whatever it was.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Anyway, I just want you to understand your point of view of really, is there anything we can do other than pray for the Mexican people?
Absolutely.
I mean, they are under the thumb. It's like when we first started flying down there, the Catholic Church is either lets you do things or it doesn't, and it's generally up to the president's wife. If she doesn't want anybody going in there, you're not going in there.
Wow.
We had people that would go in and, a 6 months tourist visa. So then they found out that they were actually maybe a missionary, and they would cut them down to 30 days or maybe 10 days, something like that.
Okay. Well, just before we take a break, Victor, any comments about that?
Yeah. Absolutely. There's a lot of things that we could do. The United States has been sending Mexico billions of dollars under the Merida Initiative. It actually started when I was serving there.
Right.
And we haven't seen absolutely no results out of that. But one of them that I talk about in the book is to designate some of these cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
Yes.
That's one huge step that the United States can take to start to wipe these cartels out, because they have the control of not just the governments, the politicians, the cities. They're they're true terrorists, and their ideology might not be like the one from ISIS or the Taliban, but it definitely it doesn't matter to me that what their ideology is. It's money or power. But they've already broken the record from 2019 in 2020, over 36,000 murders.
Yeah. And billions of dollars from every year that they pull in. Not to mention just the drug issue I want to talk about, because you talk about this, more than 70,000 Americans die from drug overdoses each year. Some of that, not all of it, most of it, I guess would probably be a better way to say it, comes from Mexico. So we're going to talk about that as well. And just maybe compare them to like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. So we'll get back into that in just a minute. But we also want to give some more of you a chance to ask a question or make a comment. You've been maybe concerned about what's happening at the border, maybe wondering what the future is going to be. I gave you just one illustration of how, in some respects, those on the other side of the border think that this might be open season, and we might be talking about immigration issues even more in 2021 than we were last year. So we'll talk about that. And if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you say, oh, I got to read this book, and I hope you would, about 180 pages, Agent Under Fire, A Murder and a Manifesto. And we've talked a little bit about the murder, although you've been very kind about sparing us from some of the really gory details in there. And then have a whole section on suggestions, one of which, of course, is building a wall, dealing with a true terrorist organization. So we'll continue talking about that and take your phone calls right after this.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact, and we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. Pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Victor Avila as we talk about his book, Agent Under Fire, A Murder and a Manifesto. If you would like to know a little bit more, we have a link to agentunderfirebook.com. agentunderfirebook.com. First of all, you can get a copy of the book. There is a video. It's about 1.5 minutes long. It's kind of a video trailer. Most importantly, let me also encourage you to click that button that says Contact. You might want to contact him. Some people, of course, have been contacting him for media interviews since the book's come out, but also for speaking. We haven't really talked much about your Christian faith, but you're actually convinced, and I think the book makes it very clear, that this almost looks like a miracle that God saved you in the midst of being shot, and the fact that you unfortunately lost your partner, but you're here in some respects speaking to these very important issues. So if you would want to maybe have him come and speak to your group or do a book signing or other things, you know, as COVID-19 is starting to settle down a little bit, maybe as we get some more vaccinations and things like that, there will be an opportunity. And so I hope you might think about scheduling him not only for an interview, but for a speaking engagement. So those are some opportunities. We have a number of phone calls. We're going to do our best to try to get to some of those. And in just a minute, I also want to talk about some of these other aspects of trafficking, not just human trafficking, which we tend to sometimes identify as sexual trafficking, but you also are working for some that were smugglers bringing in Afghanis and a variety of others who weren't coming here for economic opportunities. They were coming here to undermine the United States of America. But let's take some more phone calls. We'll head first of all to South Carolina. Glenn, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Victor.
Hey, Victor. How you doing today?
Doing good, Glenn. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for what you're doing. I'm all in support for the wall, but I have a few questions here. My concern when people come over, so many people dislike the wall, but I think it's more the hatred for Trump. But I notice a lot of the sheriff's departments and the police departments around the country, I just read this morning that the Charleston new sheriff, she's a lady, she said that first thing she was going to do was end the participation in the federal immigration program with Immigration Customs, ICE, and, you know, which allows sheriffs to help the federal authorities deport the immigrants living in the United States. Why are so many sheriffs doing away with that? Why would they not want to help you guys? Is it because of their hatred for Trump, or what is the reason?
It definitely has become a political issue, and it's not. It's a public safety issue. And you're absolutely right. With the reason some of these sheriffs and police chiefs around the country are not following the contact with ICE or notification to them is because of our local elected officials. And we got mayors and county commissioners dictating to the police what they can and cannot enforce. And you alluded to the program, which is called the 287G program. This is a program where local police and sheriff can notify ICE when one of a person that's already in custody, by the way, yes, already in jail for DWI, assault, family violence, murder, rape, whatever it is, notify immigration officials if they suspect that this individual is undocumented. And so it's a shame because these individuals get released back into other communities and reoffend.
Yes. Let me jump off of that because, first of all, you have some of these individuals that already have committed a crime. And so then when they say we're not only not going to help ICE take them and deport them, we're actually going to allow them, in some cases, to get back into the community. And we've had so many stories of individuals that have been raped, murdered, whatever, because of that. But there was something else that I wanted to come back to, which is worth mentioning, because not only are we talking about narcotics trafficking, we're talking about human trafficking. And as I mentioned just a minute, most of the time when we've talked about human trafficking on this program, we've talked about sexual trafficking. But I know you were doing some investigations and finding smugglers that were bringing in people into this country from Middle Eastern countries, for example. And they weren't coming here because they wanted economic opportunities. They came here with really nefarious reasons, right?
That's absolutely right. And we refer to them as special interest aliens or SIAs. And coming from special interest countries that are identified by ICE and Department of Homeland Security. These are individuals from, for example, Somalia, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Yemen, that are coming through these smuggling routes through Mexico because they consider themselves, once they're in Mexico, as good as being in the U.S. because Mexico and their lax immigration law or lack of enforcement of the law allows these individuals to be released in their country even if after they're detained or detected. And the first thing these individuals do is go up to our border and seek asylum.
Sure.
And so now the asylum is very different than the one that we've been seeing from these caravans, right? That they don't qualify. There's no credible fear. Well, some of these individuals do actually have the credible fear because they come from these special interest countries. Guess what? Then we are now forced to allow them in. Even though they go through the asylum process, they are now in the country never to be seen before. And you're absolutely right. We don't know the intention of these individuals, and that's the scary part.
And that's the point. I mean, we recognize some might have been able to get here, and they really do want to fulfill the American dream. But we also know that you look at some of these backpacks that have been found at the border, and they're in Arabic, and they've got all sorts of diagrams. I remember one, they found a diagram of a nuclear plant, and unless you thought they were going to go work in nuclear physics, you got a feeling that they had some evil intent with that. And so that's the problem. And at a time when we have not been thinking about terrorism very much, because we've been so fortunate over these last few years to not have a terrorist attack and not even really think about this is something we need to pay attention to in the future, don't you think?
Absolutely. And guess what I'm going to say that it's going to tie down to? It's going to tie right back to the cartels, because the cartels are now the ones that have contact. They are the smugglers now. The cartels are no longer just drug cartels. These are, I consider them foreign terrorist organizations, and they deal in trafficking of all kinds. Humans, illicit drugs, goods, fentanyl, methamphetamine, you name it. Anything that's illicit, you will contact. And guess what? They realize that it pays more to smuggle SIAs than they do Central Americans or Mexican nationals. And so it's all the same organizations that we're dealing with.
Wow. Let's take some more phone calls. We'll go to Georgia this time. Sarah, you're on with Victor.
Hello, Victor. How are you?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you. Victor, well, first of all, thank you for your service and all that you do. I truly appreciate it. I am a retired military spouse, and I actually have a nephew who is an ICE agent. So I can relate to everything you've been talking about in a sense. I don't know too much because he doesn't really share too much with me, obviously. However, my question is, as far as with the new administration coming in to office now, what is it that you, as an ICE agent, like to see in a change, if there is a change, if there are any changes you'd like to see for the protection of our ICE agent and for the protection of our country as far as regarding to the borders, especially with the drugs, the trafficking, and everything you just recently talked about. What is it that you think you all need to have a successful change at the border?
Great question. Absolutely. I think the number one thing is to not undo everything that this administration has put in place regarding immigration policies, asylum seeking policies. For example, the Remain in Mexico policy that President Trump instilled, having people wait in Mexico or in their home country and seek asylum from there rather than catch them and release them into our country, never to be seen before. I think it'll be dangerous if under a Biden administration, if they would stop the construction of the wall, if they would try to undo every single policy that the Trump administration has put in place, which has been that have been good and have been working. And the men and women of the Border Patrol down at the border will tell you that it's been working. And so I hope they talk about technology, and that's all good. The drones, the lighting, the sensors, all of that is needed, all of the above, including the wall. And so I would like to see, if anything, not to get rid of it rather than diminish it.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll get into a couple of other issues. Some of the recommendations that we've already mentioned are, first of all, identifying these cartels as foreign terrorist organizations because they are doing what they can to undermine the United States of America and getting very handsome profits in the process. Build the Wall, which is one we've talked about. And then you've got a section here on Stop Sanctuary Cities. It kind of relates a little bit to the conversation we just had a minute ago with Glenn, so maybe I will get into that. And then just the whole idea of, well, if we ever really were serious, and I'm wondering if Congress is, but if we were ever really serious about immigration reform, what would that look like? And so those are some very important aspects of that book as well. Agent Under Fire, A Murder and a Manifesto. You can go to agentunderfire.com if you want to get some more information. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
The book is entitled Agent Under Fire, and of course it tells the story of the assault and the murder on Highway 57, but has quite a bit of great information as well about what to do with the issue of immigration and immigration reform. But one of the chapters dealt with the issue of sanctuary cities. We have listeners that find themselves maybe even in a sanctuary state. And so what about that? Because as an ICE agent, you've had a chance to see of the impact that that's had in terms of trying to address some of these issues.
It's definitely a public safety impact and a public safety issue when it comes to sanctuary cities. In the case of California, it's a sanctuary state, and it doesn't allow ICE to identify these individuals that are, by the way, we mentioned this, already in custody because they've committed a crime, to be processed and deported after they serve their sentence. All we want is that sheriff's department or that city to notify immigration officials so they could process them and remove this individual that is in this country illegally to begin with. Not only just illegal here, but committing crimes. And some of these crimes, as you know, are heinous crimes. And so what happens is these sanctuary city policies release these individuals. Sometimes ICE will catch them and will deport them. Well, they come right back. And guess where they come back? They come back to the same community. Right. And sometimes they victimize U.S. citizens, but their own community as well. Mm-hmm. And so it's a public safety issue that the sanctuary city policies, they say, will protect the individuals, but only it does quite the opposite, is endangering the community.
Yes. And again, some of those individuals will not report the crime because if they're there illegally, they don't want to then put a flag on them. So in some respects, it's just a situation where people find themselves in the shadows and then they're being manipulated, being exploited. Of course, all sorts of other issues there as well. So that's just another one of those chapters in the book. But you have a whole section on immigration reform. I have to be somewhat skeptical as to whether or not we're going to see anything that looks like immigration reform in the next couple of years. I'd like to believe we would. But part of your concern is this issue that you just mentioned a minute ago, catch and release. My joke has been, I like to fly fish, and catch and release is great for fly fishing, but it's terrible for immigration. And so that, and then all these settlements, making the priority of deporting criminal aliens, prosecuting juvenile drug smugglers. You've got a lot of ideas there, and those are things that if people are serious about immigration reform, you take them through step by step to the things that could actually make this country a lot safer than it is right now.
Absolutely, and it's a two phases. It's dealing with immigration reform, and we've heard this term that I actually don't even like the term immigration reform, because politicians have used it to get elected. Yes. And never done anything about it, even when they had the opportunity to do it when they had control of the Congress. But immigration reform is two parts to it. The legal aspect of it needs to be reformed. We cannot afford to the United States is a very, very humanitarian country and allows over 1 million people in legally a year. And some of these people wait 12, 13 years to get in here on a permanent resident alien status. That needs to be reformed, because you cannot have the illegals and coming in and cutting in line, which frustrates the other. So it's a two-tier system that we have to look at. Now, when it comes to the illegal part of it, we need to start enforcing the immigration law that we already have. We have immigration and strong immigration laws in our books that we could use to enforce, and all we have to do is start enforcing those laws to have these individuals be held accountable for their activity and their illegal entry into the country. And that's ending catch and release. It's by detecting and detaining rather than detecting and releasing. And a lot of people think that they really are released back into their country. No, most of this time, because of the asylum seeking, they're being released into our country. That's what catch and release is.
Yes. I might just mention, some people might say, well, what's a biblical view on this idea of immigration? I have this booklet that we've made available in the past, a biblical view on immigration, because on the one hand, we want to treat anybody who is an alien or an immigrant or a sojourner, to use the Old Testament verses, with compassion, but we also want to follow the rule of law, which is Romans 13, 1 through 7. So we kind of take you through some of those issues in case you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know how to think about this biblically. That's something we've talked about on this program as well. But just before we run out of time, let me talk about some other issues, because as we go to your website, again, agentunderfirebook.com, there's an opportunity for people to hear you come and speak. But I might just mention that one of the other things you've been involved with now in this community is you've been seeing what's going on in the classrooms, and you've actually spent some time on a committee recognizing that if we're not careful, some of these Marxist ideologies are making their way into the public schools. What have you found?
Absolutely. I served in the District Diversity Council. That was the name of the council for the Carroll Independent School District. I'm actually still an active member of it. Right. And initially I thought it was going to be a good program to, bring awareness. And it's always good to have awareness of different cultures.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that. But that's that was not the agenda whatsoever. And I was one of very few conservative individuals in this committee that opposed these policies. For example, identifying microaggressions and what a microaggression would do to a student and his record if it was identified as such. And so that type of behavior and identification of our kids is not something that I want at least my children to be taught. There's
critical
courses,
race theory was all part of it.
Critical race theory.
Yes.
They're
White
teaching
fragility, all the stuff that we've talked about on this program.
They're teaching the racism. They're teaching the not the adequate history that we want. And so it starts at the local level, and that's why I became wanted to serve as a city councilman. It didn't happen for me this time, but very interested in giving back at one point.
Well, again, I would encourage you to maybe schedule Victor to come and speak. First of all, of course, he can speak to the issue of immigration and ICE and border security and all that. But I want you to know he's just not a one-hat kind of person, because he can also speak to this issue. And because of his Hispanic background, he can speak to some of these issues about the critical race theory being taught in the public schools, some of these Marxist ideologies that are being promoted in the public schools, and really give you an opportunity to hear from him as well. So if you want to contact him, we have a link to that. This book, about 180 pages, tells the story of this incredible attack on you agents on Highway 57. A couple pictures in here, which is a chance to kind of see what your family looks like and all of the rest. And then also some great material about immigration reform. So, again, I appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Point of View, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you very much for having me, Kerby.
Just before we end, let me mention, guess what? We're going to be watching the 2 U.S. Senate elections in Georgia today. We'll have full coverage about that tomorrow. And then, of course, tomorrow, you might have noticed there was going to be the counting of the Electoral College, and that'll be taking place about the time we broadcast. And so we'll cover what's going on there, who is saying what, and what is happening at which point, and we'll see if we can give some of that coverage tomorrow, and then we'll even pick up a little bit more of that on Thursday. And don't forget, of course, we have our Friday weekend edition. So lots of great material that we have posted on the website, information about this book, which is there, information about the book with David French there as well. My Viewpoints commentary today, all about the turmoil that we have faced in 2020 that is now spilling over into 2021. And so if you want to find some of that information, it's all available at our website. Of course, my Take Action item is where you can get a copy of my voter fraud booklet. If you want to get a copy of this one on immigration, that's available as well. And it is all available at our website, pointofview.net. So we'll be watching what happens tonight. We'll be certainly keeping track of what happens tomorrow. It is going to be a busy week, and if nothing else, I hope you will tune to Point of View every day as your trusted source of news, information, and commentary. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes, and we'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Everyone here at Point of View Radio wishes you a joyous 2021, and we begin the year with a great big thank you. We are thankful for everyone who supported our $100,000 matching challenge in the final days of 2020. Thanks to you and so many others, we reached our goal. You gave, another friend matched your gift, doubling your impact, and we promise to be the best stewards we can be in using those gifts in the smartest ways possible to continue our nearly 50-year mission of bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, grounded in biblical truth. You have our greatest appreciation for your sacrifice. And if you were away and didn't get a chance to give, we are making a push to add more listeners, and your gifts now will help us reach more people. Pointofview.net/year-end and 1-800-347-5151. Together, we will make a difference in 2021. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Again, from all of us at Point of View, thank you for your partnership. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.